They say the most dangerous questions are the ones that sound harmless at first. I never thought one sentence could undo years of silence and restraint. But the truth is, that's how it began, a single question. It was a late afternoon, the kind where the light filters through the curtains in golden streaks, painting everything in false calm. I sat at the kitchen table, leafing through a magazine without really seeing the words, when he walked in. His presence had always unsettled me in ways I refused to name. Too steady, too observant, as though he could see past the mask I wore for everyone else. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He sat across from me, leaning forward with a quiet intensity that made my chest tighten. His eyes, dark, searching, did not look away when he spoke. "Are you happy?" The words were so deceptively simple that, for a moment, I almost laughed. People ask each other that all the time, don't they? At birthdays, anniversaries, casual conversations over coffee. But this was different. He wasn't asking the way acquaintances ask, expecting a polite, "of course." He was asking as if my answer mattered, as if my truth was something he could hold in his hands. I opened my mouth, ready to deliver the familiar line, "Yes, I'm fine." "Everything's fine," but the words caught in my throat. In that instant, I saw my husband's face in my mind. Daniel, dependable to the point of dullness, whose love for me had long ago hardened into habit. I saw the walls of our house, neat and well-kept but suffocating, each room echoing with conversations we no longer had. I saw myself, moving through the routines of wife and mother, like a shadow of the woman I once was. So instead of lying, I whispered the truth. "No, I'm not." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. My admission felt like a betrayal in itself, a fracture that could never be mended. Yet strangely, I didn't feel regret. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of honesty in my chest, sharp but freeing. He didn't recoil. He didn't fill the space with sympathy or hollow comfort. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine, a brief, delicate gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. The warmth of his touch traveled up my arm like a spark, awakening something I had buried so deeply I almost forgot it was there. That was the moment the line was drawn. The moment I knew everything I thought was safe and certain could no longer remain untouched. I should have pulled away, should have wrapped myself back in silence. Instead, I stayed. And with that, the question lingered between us, not yet answered fully, not yet acted upon, but alive, dangerous, and undeniable. To understand why his question shook me so deeply, you need to know the life I had been living. On the outside, it was a portrait of stability, one that neighbors, colleagues, and even close friends envied. My husband, Daniel, was the kind of man people described as dependable. He provided well, worked tirelessly, and never raised his voice. In public, his hand on my back felt reassuring, almost protective. In private, it felt more like a placeholder, a gesture performed out of habit rather than desire. We had built a life that checked every box, a house with walls painted in warm colors, children whose laughter filled the halls, a marriage that looked steady enough to withstand time. And yet, beneath the neatness of it all, I carried a quiet ache, a loneliness that had no shape but grew heavier with each passing year. Daniel and I had stopped talking about dreams, stopped asking about each other's thoughts. We discussed grocery lists, bills, and the schedules of our children. The silences at dinner were no longer awkward. They had simply become normal. I told myself often that this was marriage. That passion was fleeting, and companionship was what truly mattered. But the truth was more painful. I had become invisible in my own home, my needs buried beneath routine, my voice dulled into whispers even I stopped hearing. And then there was him. He wasn't a stranger, which made everything worse. He was someone who had orbited our lives for years, close enough to be trusted, far enough to never be considered a threat. He carried himself with quiet assurance, a man who listened more than he spoke, whose words seemed to weigh more because they were so rarely wasted. Around him, I felt exposed, seen in ways Daniel had stopped noticing long ago. His presence unsettled me, not with loud declarations, but with subtle attentiveness that pierced through my defenses. That afternoon in the kitchen wasn't the first time our eyes had lingered longer than necessary, nor the first time I had felt the stirrings of something I dared not name, but it was the first time the unspoken became spoken. The first time my dissatisfaction was laid bare for someone else to witness. The conflict was no longer internal. With one question, "Are you happy?" he had drawn it out into the open, where it could not be ignored. My life, so carefully constructed, now stood at the edge of something dangerous. I could return to silence, patch the cracks, and continue pretending. Or I could lean into the temptation of being seen, of being wanted, of remembering who I had been before duty swallowed me whole. As his hand brushed mine across the table, I realized the choice was already unfolding. What I thought was stability was, in fact, a fragile illusion, and illusions shatter the moment truth steps in. In the days that followed his question, I found myself carrying his words like a hidden ember, glowing quietly in the back of my mind. I tried to shake it off, tried to bury it beneath errands and household chores, but it lingered. His voice, steady and unflinching, echoed whenever I caught myself staring into nothing, whenever I moved through the motions of a life that no longer felt like mine. Daniel noticed nothing. Or perhaps he did and chose, as always, not to ask. Our evenings remained the same. Quiet dinners, the television murmuring in the background, a kiss on the cheek before bed. His consistency, once a source of comfort, now pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. But when he entered the room, everything shifted. He would glance at me, not in passing, but with an intent that unsettled me, as though he could hear the silent answers I kept locked inside. We spoke in fragments at first. Comments about the weather, about errands, about things so trivial they might have meant nothing. Yet behind each exchange, I felt the gravity of what was unspoken. One evening, I found myself walking beside him down a quiet street after running an errand. The air was cool, scented faintly with rain. I tried to keep the conversation light, but my words stumbled. Finally, he stopped, turning toward me. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said. His tone was gentle, but the certainty in it made me tremble. "I'm not pretending," I whispered, though even as I spoke, I knew it was a lie. Pretending had become my survival. Pretending was the only thing holding my world together. His silence pressed against me harder than any accusation could. And then, without asking, he reached for my hand, not in boldness but in quiet solidarity. The touch was brief, almost fleeting, but it sparked something in me I had long thought dead. That night, lying in bed beside Daniel, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My husband's back was turned to me, his breathing steady, a rhythm I had known for years, but instead of comfort, it filled me with a hollow ache. I closed my eyes and felt again the warmth of that other hand, the unspoken promise in its touch. The conflict within me grew unbearable. Loyalty to a life I had built warred against the hunger for something more, something that made me feel alive. Each passing day, the silence at home grew heavier, while the quiet understanding in his eyes pulled me closer to a precipice. I wasn't sure I could resist. By the time I admitted to myself that I wanted him, that I needed the validation he offered, it was already too late. The distance between us had narrowed, and the line I had sworn never to cross was beginning to blur. The night of the revelation began like any other. Daniel sat across from me at dinner, absorbed in his plate, while I picked at mine in silence. The television hummed faintly in the background, a soundtrack to the hollow routine of our evenings. Nothing seemed unusual, and yet, beneath the stillness, I carried a storm. My phone vibrated against the table, its light flashing briefly. One careless moment, that's all it took. Daniel glanced at the screen before I could, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. I saw the flicker in his eyes, the faint tightening of his jaw. He didn't speak immediately, but I felt the air shift, heavy with unspoken suspicion. Later, when the children were asleep and the house had settled into quiet, he came to me. His face was pale, his voice strained but controlled. "Who is he?" he asked. The question struck me like a blade, sharp and direct. My chest tightened as though the truth itself had been ripped from me. I wanted to deny it, to weave a quick lie, but the exhaustion of months of secrecy pressed down until I could no longer breathe under it. Tears welled in my eyes before words even formed. "It wasn't supposed to happen," I whispered. "I didn't plan it, Daniel. I didn't mean to hurt you." His expression didn't change. No shouting, no accusations, just a hollow emptiness that was far worse. "You could have told me," he said quietly. "You could have said you weren't happy. Instead, you chose this." The weight of his disappointment crushed me. I tried to explain, fumbling with words that felt inadequate. How could I describe the years of loneliness, the silence that had grown between us like a wall? How could I confess that when someone finally asked me if I was happy, I realized how far I had drifted from myself? But explanations don't undo betrayal. Each word I offered seemed to fall flat, widening the distance between us. Daniel turned away, his shoulders rigid, his silence louder than any fury. For the first time in years, I wished he would shout, that his anger might burn away the guilt clawing at me. But instead, he left me with silence, the kind that felt final. That night, lying in bed beside him, the space between us felt cavernous. I replayed everything in my mind. The question that had started it, the moments I should have stopped, the chances I had to walk away. Each memory became a stone in my chest, suffocating me. The revelation wasn't just that Daniel knew. It was that I could no longer lie to myself. The marriage I had clung to was fractured beyond recognition, and the person I had been, dutiful wife, quiet companion, was gone. As the first light of morning crept through the curtains, I knew there was no returning to the life I once had. What remained was something unrecognizable, fragile, and terrifyingly uncertain. Morning arrived, but nothing about it felt ordinary. The sunlight fell across our bedroom floor, the same as it always had, but to me it looked colder, harsher, as if the world itself had changed shape overnight. Daniel rose without a word, his movements deliberate, his silence unbroken. The absence of his voice was louder than any argument we might have had. I remained in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every choice that had led us here. Guilt was no longer an abstract weight. It was a living presence, pressing into my chest with every breath. Yet beneath the guilt, another truth stirred, a realization I could no longer deny. I had been starving for years, and when someone finally noticed, I had surrendered. Not out of malice, not out of recklessness, but out of desperation to feel alive again. The days that followed were a blur of strained conversations and careful avoidance. Daniel didn't throw accusations at me, nor did he ask for details. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man whose world had cracked, but who refused to let the pieces scatter in front of others. Around the children, he remained steady. With me, he remained distant. His restraint, though admirable, was unbearable. I longed for him to demand an explanation, to give me the chance to pour out everything I had kept hidden. But he didn't. Instead, his silence forced me inward, into a reflection I could not escape. I asked myself again and again, why hadn't I spoken sooner? Why hadn't I told him years ago that I was fading into the background of my own life? Perhaps because I was afraid of being seen as ungrateful, afraid of unraveling the stability I thought I owed everyone else, afraid of admitting that love without connection feels like exile. The man who had asked me that fateful question, "Are you happy?" faded from my days soon after, not because the pull between us lessened, but because I knew I could not continue. What had once felt like salvation now felt like a wound that could never heal if I kept reopening it. Letting go of him wasn't a victory. It was a necessity. And so Daniel and I remained, not as we had been, but as two people standing on fractured ground, trying to decide whether to rebuild or to walk away. Some days I saw a flicker of possibility in his eyes, a quiet willingness to start again. Other days, the distance between us seemed permanent, a chasm too wide to cross. What I know is this: betrayal doesn't vanish. It lingers like a scar beneath the skin. But scars, as painful as they are, remind us that healing is still possible. If there is one thing I've learned, it's that silence can destroy more than words ever will, and though I can't undo what I've done, I can no longer hide behind the lie of being fine. The question remains, am I happy? And maybe the truest answer is that I'm still searching.